Grandpa Joe had been quiet all evening until he stood up and made an announcement that revealed a family secret spanning 3 generations and changed everything. The backyard was perfect that Saturday afternoon. We had strung up those warm white lights between the oak trees, and my mother-in-law had insisted on the good china even though we were eating outside. My son had just graduated with honors, and honestly, I was bursting with pride. The whole extended family was there: aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen since Christmas, neighbors who had watched him grow up from a scraped-knee kid to this confident young man heading off to college in the fall. Joe, my father-in-law, had been unusually quiet all day. Normally he'd be telling his same 3 fishing stories or complaining about the weather, but he just sat in his lawn chair near the rose bushes, nursing the same beer for what felt like hours. My husband kept asking if he was feeling all right, and Joe would just nod and wave him off. I figured maybe the reality of his grandson leaving for college was hitting him harder than he expected. The afternoon was winding down when Joe suddenly pushed himself up from his chair. The metal legs scraped against the concrete patio, and something about the deliberate way he stood made everyone stop mid-conversation. My sister-in-law was halfway through telling someone about her new job, my mother was collecting empty plates, and the kids were still running around with sparklers left over from the 4th of July. But Joe clearing his throat had this effect where the whole party just paused. He looked around at all of us, his weathered hands gripping the back of his chair, and I swear I could see something different in his eyes. Not the usual gentle, slightly tired look he always had, but something sharper. More intense. My stomach did this weird flip because Joe never commanded attention like this. He was the kind of man who preferred to blend into the background, content to let others do the talking. Then he opened his mouth and said he had something important to tell us all. Something he should have told us years ago. The way he said it made my blood run cold. My husband reached over and grabbed my hand without even thinking about it. Our son stopped throwing a football with his cousin and came closer to the patio. Even the neighbors who were starting to pack up their folding chairs seemed to sense something was happening and lingered. Joe took a deep breath and told us that he had been living under a false identity for 40 years. I felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. False identity? This was Joe. Joe who mowed his lawn every Saturday morning at exactly 8 a.m. Joe who still had his first dollar bill framed in his workshop. Joe who complained about kids these days but secretly slipped $20 bills to his grandchildren when he thought nobody was looking. He continued, his voice getting steadier as he went on. He said his real name wasn't Joe at all. It was Antonio Rossetti. He had been in witness protection since the early 1980s after testifying against organized crime families in Chicago. The FBI had relocated him here, given him a new name, a new background, a whole new life. My mother-in-law's face went completely white. She was gripping her pearl necklace so tight I thought she might break it. My husband looked like he was going to be sick. I mean, this was his father. The man who taught him how to change a tire and took him fishing every summer at the same lake for 20 years. And now he was telling us he was essentially a complete stranger. Joe kept talking, explaining how everything we knew about the family history was fabricated by federal agents. The stories about growing up on a farm in Ohio, meeting grandma at a church social, his time in the army, all lies carefully constructed to give him a believable past. He said the agents had been thorough, creating photo albums, documents, even fake relatives who would corroborate his story if anyone ever came asking questions. I was trying to process what this meant for all of us. My son was staring at his grandfather like he'd never seen him before. This was the man who had taught him how to whittle, who never missed a single baseball game or school play. How do you reconcile that with the image of someone running from dangerous criminals? How do you suddenly accept that the gentle old man who falls asleep watching baseball was once important enough to warrant federal protection? The party had completely stopped. Nobody was eating or drinking or making small talk anymore. We were all just standing there in our backyard, surrounded by graduation decorations and half-eaten cake, trying to understand how our ordinary suburban life had suddenly become the plot of a crime movie. Joe continued explaining how hard it had been to keep the secret all these years. How he'd wanted to tell Grandma the truth so many times, especially when she was sick those last few months. How he'd practiced the speech in his head countless times, never sure if he'd actually have the courage to go through with it. He said seeing his grandson graduate and preparing to start his own adult life made him realize he couldn't take this secret to his grave. Then something shifted in his expression. I caught it just for a second, this little twitch at the corner of his mouth that I'd seen before when he was trying not to laugh at his own jokes. And then Joe started chuckling. Not a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable giggle, but a full-on, belly-shaking chuckle that grew louder and louder until he was practically doubled over. We all stood there completely confused, still processing the witness protection bombshell, and he was laughing like he'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. When he finally caught his breath, he looked around at all of our shocked faces and admitted that he had made the entire thing up. I think my brain short-circuited for a moment. Made it up? The witness protection, the false identity, Antonio Rossetti, all of it was fake? My husband actually stumbled backward and had to sit down on the porch steps. My son was shaking his head like he was trying to clear water out of his ears. Joe explained that he was tired of being seen as boring old grandpa. He said he'd spent his whole life being predictable and ordinary, and he wanted just one exciting story to tell before it was too late. He wanted people to look at him and think there might be more beneath the surface than they realized. The witness protection story, he confessed, came from some crime drama series he'd been binge-watching on Netflix during the long winter months. He'd gotten so absorbed in the show that he started imagining what it would be like to have lived that kind of dramatic life. And somehow that fantasy had grown into this elaborate prank he'd been planning for months. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or throw something at him. The emotional whiplash was incredible. In the span of 10 minutes, I'd gone from proud graduation party host to shocked family member discovering dark secrets to complete bewilderment at being pranked by a 78-year-old man. But as I looked around at everyone's faces, I realized something interesting was happening. My mother-in-law was starting to smile. Not a polite smile, but a real one that reached her eyes. My husband was shaking his head, but I could see he was fighting back laughter. Even my son, who had looked genuinely upset just moments before, was beginning to grin. Because the truth was, Joe had succeeded in showing us a different side of himself. Not the mysterious criminal-chasing version he'd invented, but the mischievous, creative, slightly rebellious version that had been hiding under the surface all along. The man who would spend months planning an elaborate prank just to surprise his family. The man who cared enough about how we saw him to go to these ridiculous lengths. Update 1. The aftermath of Joe's grand revelation was unlike anything I could have imagined. You'd think that after discovering your father-in-law had essentially punked the entire family, things would go back to normal pretty quickly. But that's not what happened at all. For the next few weeks, Joe became something of a neighborhood celebrity. Word spread about his graduation party stunt, and suddenly everyone wanted to hear the story firsthand. The mailman would linger at our front door hoping to catch Joe outside. The lady at the grocery store checkout would ask my mother-in-law if it was true that her husband had pretended to be in witness protection. Even the teenagers working at the local pizza place knew about it somehow. Joe was absolutely loving the attention. This man who had spent decades content to fade into the background was now holding court at the coffee shop downtown, retelling his prank with dramatic flair to anyone who would listen. He'd embellish different details each time, making the story more elaborate and ridiculous. Sometimes Antonio Rossetti had been an undercover agent. Sometimes he'd been the key witness in a bank robbery case. The version kept evolving, and Joe seemed delighted by his newfound reputation as the neighborhood character. My husband was having a harder time adjusting. He kept muttering about trust and communication, though I could tell he was secretly impressed by his father's creativity. But what really bothered him was how easily Joe had fooled us all. He started questioning other stories from his childhood, wondering what else might have been exaggerated or completely fabricated. Did Joe really catch that enormous fish when my husband was 12? Had he actually played semi-professional baseball in his 20s like he'd always claimed? The paranoia was getting ridiculous. My husband would analyze every casual comment his father made, looking for signs of deception. When Joe mentioned seeing a hawk in the backyard, my husband would interrogate him about the exact time, location, and species. It was like he was determined to never be fooled again, but he was driving himself crazy in the process. Meanwhile, my son was taking the whole thing completely differently. Instead of feeling betrayed or confused, he seemed genuinely impressed by his grandfather's elaborate planning and commitment to the bit. He started asking Joe for advice about pranks and storytelling, treating him like some kind of master strategist. They would spend hours together in Joe's workshop, supposedly fixing old furniture but actually plotting minor pranks to play on the rest of the family. This new dynamic worried me a little. My son was already naturally mischievous, and having Joe as a willing accomplice was like adding gasoline to a fire. They convinced my mother-in-law that the city was planning to tear down her favorite oak tree, complete with fake notices and official-looking documents they'd created on my son's laptop. They told the neighbors that Joe was writing his memoirs and would be revealing shocking secrets about everyone on the street. They even managed to convince my sister-in-law that Joe had secretly learned Italian during his alleged witness protection years and would only communicate with her in broken phrases he'd picked up from cooking shows. But the strangest part was how the prank had affected Joe's relationship with my mother-in-law. Instead of being angry or hurt that he'd deceived everyone, she seemed more interested in him than she had been in years. I'd catch them laughing together over coffee in the morning, and she'd look at him with this expression I hadn't seen since they were newlyweds. It was like discovering he had hidden depths had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. One evening about a month after the graduation party, I was helping her with the dishes when she confided that Joe's prank had made her realize how much she'd taken him for granted. She said that after 45 years of marriage, she'd stopped really seeing him as a person with his own inner life and had started thinking of him as just a comfortable, predictable presence. The witness protection story, ridiculous as it was, had forced her to imagine him as someone with secrets and complexity and hidden adventures. I understood what she meant, but it also made me think about my own marriage. How well did I really know my husband after all these years? How much of what I thought I knew about him was assumption and habit rather than actual understanding? Joe's prank hadn't just revealed something about himself, it had held up a mirror to all of our relationships and made us question how much we really saw each other. Things took an unexpected turn when my son came home from school one day with news that would change everything again. He'd been telling his friends about his grandfather's prank, and one of his teachers had overheard the story. This teacher happened to be married to someone who worked for a local television station, and they were interested in doing a human interest segment about Joe's elaborate joke. Joe was thrilled at the prospect of being on television, but my husband was horrified. He begged his father not to go through with it, worried that making the story public would somehow embarrass the family or make them look foolish. But Joe had gotten a taste of being interesting and attention-grabbing, and he wasn't about to give it up. The interview was scheduled for the following week, and Joe spent days preparing. He practiced his story over and over, refining the details and working on his delivery. He even bought a new shirt for the occasion, a bold blue button-down that my mother-in-law said made his eyes look younger. I hadn't seen him this excited about anything in years. But 2 days before the interview was supposed to happen, something occurred that none of us saw coming. Update 2. The phone call came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. I was barely awake, fumbling for the coffee maker, when the kitchen phone rang. It was my mother-in-law, and her voice sounded strange, shaky, and confused in a way that immediately made me wide awake. She said Joe had received a call the night before from someone claiming to be with the federal government. The caller knew details about Joe's witness protection story that he'd never told anyone. They knew about Antonio Rossetti, about the Chicago connections, even about specific elements of the fabricated testimony that Joe thought he'd invented completely from his imagination. My first thought was that this had to be another layer of Joe's prank. Maybe he was trying to make his fake story seem more believable before the television interview. But my mother-in-law insisted this was different. She said Joe had gone completely pale during the phone conversation and had barely spoken since hanging up. I drove over to their house immediately, leaving my confused husband to figure out his own breakfast. Joe was sitting in his kitchen still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring at a cup of coffee that had obviously gone cold hours ago. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, like something had drained all the energy and mischief right out of him. When he saw me, he just shook his head and said he didn't understand what was happening. The person on the phone had asked him why he was telling people about his protected status. They'd warned him that going public with his story could put him and his family in danger. They'd mentioned specific names and dates that aligned perfectly with the fictional background he'd created for his prank. I tried to stay rational about it. I pointed out that anyone could have researched Chicago crime families from the 1980s and found names that matched his story. The internet made it easy to create convincing fake information, and maybe someone was trying to prank him back. But Joe kept insisting that the details were too specific, too accurate to his made-up version of events. That's when he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that when he'd originally created the Antonio Rossetti character for his prank, he hadn't actually researched real crime families at all. He'd made up the names, the dates, the circumstances completely from his imagination. But according to the phone call, everything he'd invented had actually happened. The person on the phone had mentioned a restaurant bombing in 1983 that Joe had included in his fake testimony. They'd referenced a specific prosecutor who had supposedly handled Joe's case. They'd even known about a detail involving a blue sedan that Joe was certain he'd made up on the spot during the graduation party. My rational mind was screaming that this had to be a coincidence or some kind of elaborate research, but there was something in Joe's eyes that made me doubt my skepticism. He looked genuinely terrified, not like someone who was continuing a prank or dealing with a simple case of mistaken identity. We decided to call the local police, more to document the strange phone call than because we thought there was any real danger. The officer who came to take the report was polite but clearly thought we were dealing with a senior citizen who'd gotten confused about reality and fiction. He suggested that Joe might have unconsciously absorbed real information from news reports or documentaries and then forgotten the source, making him think he'd invented details that were actually true. That explanation might have satisfied us if not for what happened next. My son came home from school that afternoon with a story that changed everything. He said a substitute teacher had approached him during lunch asking casual questions about his grandfather. Nothing threatening or suspicious, just friendly inquiries about Joe's health, his hobbies, whether he talked much about his past. The substitute claimed to be a family friend who'd lost touch with Joe years ago and was hoping to reconnect. But when my son described the woman, none of us recognized her. And when we called the school to ask about the substitute teacher, we discovered that no substitute had been scheduled for that day. The regular teacher had been present for all classes and no unfamiliar adults had been reported in the building. Now we were all genuinely scared. Whatever was happening was moving beyond weird phone calls and into the realm of people physically approaching our family members. I kept trying to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation, but the pattern was too strange to dismiss. Joe made the decision to cancel the television interview. He said he didn't want to take any chances with his family's safety even if the whole situation turned out to be an elaborate misunderstanding. The local reporter was disappointed but understanding, especially when Joe explained that he'd received some concerning phone calls about the story. But canceling the interview didn't make the strange incident stop. Over the next few days, we noticed cars parked on our street that didn't belong to any of the neighbors. People would sit in them for hours, sometimes taking pictures of Joe's house. When my husband tried to approach one of the vehicles, it drove away immediately. We reported these incidents to the police as well, but without any direct threats or illegal activity, there wasn't much they could do. The stress was taking a toll on everyone. Joe barely left his house and had stopped his daily walks around the neighborhood. My mother-in-law was jumping at every unexpected sound. My son was asking if he needed to be worried about going to school. And my husband was alternating between fury at his father for starting this mess and genuine concern for the family's safety. I was trying to hold everyone together while dealing with my own growing anxiety. I'd wake up at night wondering if someone was watching our house too. I'd find myself checking and rechecking the locks, looking over my shoulder when I was running errands, analyzing every stranger I encountered for signs of unusual interest in our family. The breaking point came when my mother-in-law found someone going through their garbage at 3 in the morning. She'd gotten up for a glass of water and saw a flashlight moving around near their trash cans. When she woke Joe and they looked out the window together, they could see someone methodically examining the contents of their weekly refuse. Joe called the police immediately, but by the time officers arrived, the person was gone. They did find evidence that someone had been there. The garbage bags had been carefully opened and resealed, and there were footprints in the soft dirt around the cans that didn't match any of the family's shoes. That's when Joe made a decision that surprised all of us. Instead of continuing to hide and worry, he announced that he was going to figure out what was really going on. He said he'd spent weeks being scared and confused, but now he was angry. Someone was terrorizing his family over a story he'd made up as a harmless prank, and he wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. The next morning, Joe did something completely out of character. He drove to the downtown library and spent hours researching everything he could find about Chicago organized crime in the 1980s. He was determined to understand how his fictional story had lined up so perfectly with real events and whether there was any logical explanation for the attention his family had been receiving. What he discovered would turn our understanding of the entire situation upside down once again. Final update. Joe's research at the library yielded results that none of us were prepared for. After spending 3 full days going through newspaper archives, court records, and FBI documents that had been declassified over the years, he made a discovery that left us all speechless. Antonio Rossetti was real. Not only was he real, but his story matched Joe's fabricated version with uncanny accuracy. There had been a witness protection case in the early 1980s involving someone with that exact name who had testified against Chicago crime families. The restaurant bombing, the specific prosecutor, even the detail about the blue sedan, all of it had actually happened. But here's where the story takes its most incredible turn. Antonio Rossetti had died in 1987, just 5 years after entering witness protection. According to the official records, Rossetti had been killed in what appeared to be a random car accident in Oregon. The case had been closed, his handlers had moved on to other assignments, and his story had become just another file in the vast bureaucracy of federal law enforcement. Joe sat us all down in his living room and laid out photocopies of everything he'd found. Death certificate, newspaper articles about the accident, even a brief mention in a book about organized crime prosecutions. Antonio Rossetti had been a real person with a real story, and he had really died more than 30 years ago. So who had been calling Joe and watching our family? The answer came from an unexpected source. My son, who had been staying close to home since the strange incidents began, was in Joe's workshop helping him organize the research materials when he noticed something odd about one of the photocopied documents. The library's copy machine had printed the date and time stamp at the bottom of each page, but one of the documents showed it had been copied just 2 days before Joe's first trip to the library. Someone else had been researching Antonio Rossetti recently. Someone who had accessed the same records Joe had found, possibly even before Joe's graduation party prank had become public knowledge. Joe took this information back to the police, and this time they took his concerns more seriously. The detective assigned to the case explained that sometimes old witness protection cases attracted attention from amateur researchers, true crime enthusiasts, or even distant family members trying to piece together relatives' mysterious disappearances. The interest in Joe's story might have triggered someone who had been researching the real Antonio Rossetti to investigate whether there was a connection. But the detective also mentioned another possibility that chilled us all. Sometimes criminal organizations kept long memories about people who had testified against them. Even though Antonio Rossetti had been dead for decades, the families he'd testified against might still have people who remembered his name and his story. Joe's public claims about being Rossetti could have attracted attention from individuals who hadn't realized the real witness had died years ago. The investigation that followed revealed the truth behind our weeks of fear and confusion. The person who had been watching our family and going through Joe's garbage was a private investigator hired by the grandson of one of the crime family members that the real Antonio Rossetti had testified against. This grandson had spent years researching his family's history and had come across references to Rossetti's testimony in old court records. When word reached him about Joe's graduation party story, he'd hired the investigator to determine whether Joe was actually the witness who had helped convict his grandfather decades earlier. The irony was staggering. Joe's completely fictional prank had intersected with real history in a way that could have never been predicted. His made-up story had been so believable because, unbeknownst to him, he'd accidentally recreated events that had actually occurred. The private investigator, once he realized that Joe was clearly not the real Antonio Rossetti and that the real witness had been dead for over 30 years, backed off immediately. The crime family grandson, apparently satisfied that there was no connection between Joe and his family's past, called off the investigation. The detective assured us that there was no ongoing danger to our family but recommended that Joe be more careful about what personal information he shared publicly in the future. He also suggested that we might want to consider the witness protection story officially retired from Joe's repertoire of entertaining tales. In the weeks that followed, our family slowly returned to normal. The strange cars disappeared from our street, the mysterious phone calls stopped, and Joe resumed his daily walks around the neighborhood. But the experience had changed all of us in ways we were still discovering. Joe, surprisingly, seemed more energized than ever. Instead of being traumatized by the ordeal, he appeared to be invigorated by having lived through what he called his own real-life mystery. He'd started working on what he claimed was a factual account of the entire experience, planning to submit it to magazines or maybe even write a book about how a simple prank had intersected with actual history. My mother-in-law had mixed feelings about the whole situation. On one hand, she was relieved that there was no real danger and that life could return to normal. On the other hand, she was slightly annoyed that Joe's storytelling had evolved from harmless family pranks to elaborate tales that attracted federal investigators and private detectives. She'd started threatening to fact-check all of his future stories before he was allowed to tell them in public. My husband had developed a grudging respect for his father's accidental brush with real intrigue, though he still insisted that Joe needed to be more careful about the stories he invented. He'd also become somewhat of a local expert on witness protection procedures and organized crime history, having spent so much time researching the real Antonio Rossetti case to understand what had happened to our family. My son, predictably, thought the entire experience was the coolest thing that had ever happened to anyone he knew. He'd started telling the story to his friends with the same dramatic flair that Joe brought to his tales, and I suspected that we might be dealing with 2 generations of family storytellers from now on. As for me, I'd learned something important about the power of stories and the unexpected ways that fiction can intersect with reality. Joe's harmless prank had taught us all that the line between imagination and truth can be thinner than we realize, and that sometimes the most ordinary people carry the most extraordinary stories, whether they're real or not. The local television station, when they heard the full story of what had transpired after Joe's graduation party revelation, decided they wanted to do an even bigger feature about the strange coincidence. But this time, Joe politely declined. He said he'd had enough excitement for one lifetime and was ready to go back to being boring old grandpa for a while. Though knowing Joe as I did now, I suspected that his definition of boring might be quite different from everyone else's. 6 months later, at our family Christmas gathering, Joe stood up after dinner with that familiar look in his eyes that we'd all learned to recognize. My husband immediately started shaking his head, my mother-in-law put down her coffee cup with resignation, and my son leaned forward with anticipation. Joe cleared his throat and announced that he had something important to tell us all. Something about his time in the Merchant Marine that he'd never mentioned before. We all looked at each other and started laughing. Because now we knew that with Joe, you never could tell where the truth ended and the story began. And honestly, that made family gatherings a lot more interesting than they used to be.